Hello, thank you for taking out the time to watch another video on this channel. This video is on the Dashas. The Dashas are used to predict life events. In my life, I've experienced life events have panned out how I analyzed from my birth chart whether those life events were big or small. The accuracy with which the Dashas could predict life events was one of the main things that attracted me towards Vedic astrology. The Dashas can predict life events. What kind of life events? Time of marriage, rise in one's career, rise in income, name and fame, an opportunity for higher education, foreign travel, or an end to a difficult time. That is what we are going to learn. So let's begin. Now, before you go to the Dashas, my suggestion is you first read the birth chart. Understand what your birth chart is suggesting. There are many videos on this channel which might help you understand what planetary positions mean in your birth chart. What that would tell you is the potential you hold or your life holds and the direction you might take. For example, which career direction you might end up taking and what kind of a person you might end up spending your life with. But when are you going to realize this potential, the potential in your career or in your personal life, when these events are likely to unfold? That would be determined by the Dashas. And that is what we are going to learn in this video. So let's do that. On Far, Far Away, if you click this button there, you'll eventually reach the Dasha table. In this, you'll see 3 columns, and the 4th column is for the dates, which is the ending date. Think of this table as a book on your life. The first column, this is the Mahadasha. Think of this as a chapter. In our life, in the book of our life, we'd find multiple chapters. And the Mahadashas would last anywhere between 6 to 20 years. The second column is the most important one. This is the Antardasha. Think of this as a story unfolding within a chapter. Like you were studying, but you also got married, or you were working and you got to travel. So main events which we are very excited about in our life, such as hike in income or foreign travel, marriage, I think such events have to agree with the Antardasha planet. So you must always know which Antardasha you are currently going through and which Antardasha you're about to enter. This is one of the first few things I notice in a chart whilst I'm reading a birth chart. The third column is the Pratyantardasha. Think of this as a subplot. For example, during a promising Antardasha, you were promoted, but how you experience that position of authority would be determined by which Pratyantardasha were you going through. If, for example, the Antardasha is of Sun and the Pratyantardasha is of Saturn, due to Sun's promising position in your chart, you found yourself in a position of authority. Perhaps under Saturn's Pratyantardasha, you'd find your authority questioned. So the Mahadasha is the main chapter. The Antardashas are important stories of our life, and the Pratyantardashas are subplots. Now, what to expect under the Dashas of different planets? See, planets are going to rule our life at different times, and that would be determined by the position of Moon at the time of your birth. That calculation you'd find in this article on the blog of Far, Far Away on how have I arrived at these planetary combinations ruling your life at certain times. That calculation has been explained in that article. The purpose of this video is what to expect when you are under the Dasha for a particular combination of planets. Now, my understanding of that has come from the Brihadarashtra Horashastra Volume 2, and I'd like to quote from that book, the natural characteristics of the Dasha planet. Here, when I'm using the word Dasha planet, I'm referring to the Mahadasha planet, the Antardasha planet, and the Pratyantardasha planet. I have mentioned earlier that the Antardasha planet is the most important one. The natural characteristics of the Dasha planet cause general effects. I'll give you an example. If a person is going through the Antardasha of Jupiter, it's very likely the person might encounter learning opportunities. That's Jupiter's natural characteristic. It presents learning opportunities in our life. I myself have done an MBA during Jupiter's Antardasha. If you go further, and distinctive effects are realized by their placements. Now, whilst Jupiter might present learning opportunities, where Jupiter is placed in your chart and which houses is it ruling, that would determine distinctive effects. For example, if Jupiter is in the 12th house, there's a possibility you might find an opportunity to go abroad for higher studies. I'm generalizing, but I'm trying to explain how you can determine what might unfold in your life. Let's look at a few more examples. If you are under the Antardasha, for example, of Sun, you might encounter the opportunity to occupy a position of power. With Venus comes name and fame and festivity at home, including marriage. You yourself could get married. Under Saturn's Antardasha, the person might find oneself going through some challenges, but may also find oneself in a position of high responsibility or in public service. With Mercury comes learning, skills-driven education is Mercury related, and also businesses. You'd find this interesting. I started far, far away whilst I was under Mercury's Antardasha. With Moon comes good fortune, if Moon is well placed, happiness and peace of mind in general. With Mars comes the tenacity to face difficult challenges, so physical strength and execution of plans. That is what you might encounter under Mars's Dasha. Under Rahu, you might get to experience foreign things, and that might be through travel or meeting people who are different from you. And you may also find yourself under unusual circumstances. Under Ketu, again, the probability is that you find yourself in foreign circumstances which are driven by your desire to leave things behind. That's something you might encounter under Ketu's Antardasha, and with that, you may also be very spiritually inclined. Those are the general effects. Now, in this video, I'm going to explain favorable and unfavorable events in detail for every planet. So you can look at the description and then go directly to that planet. If you're, for example, entering Saturn's Antardasha, you might be interested in knowing what kind of events might unfold. Now I'm going to share distinctive effects these Dasha planets can bring into our life. There are certain planets which generally bring positive results of favorable events. They are Jupiter, Venus, and to some extent Moon. There are other planets that can present challenges in our lives, such as Saturn, Mars, Rahu, Ketu, and to some extent Sun. And Mercury gives mixed results. So just by this, you can assess, okay, if I'm going to Jupiter's Antardasha, I'm likely to encounter opportunities. Or if I'm going through Venus's Antardasha, I'm likely to encounter an opportunity to make money. Or if I'm going through the Antardasha of Saturn, things might slow down. So just by understanding the generic nature of planets, you can broadly begin to assess what might unfold in your life. For more distinctive effects, you must learn the exact position of the Dasha planet in your chart. First thing you must identify is the nakshatra and the sign this Dasha planet is occupying in your chart. Now for this person, Saturn, let's say this person is going through Saturn's Antardasha, we find Saturn in this person's case is in the nakshatra Vishaka and in the sign of Libra. Now this is where you must expertly analyze how favorable is this Saturn's position. Now, I have earlier mentioned that Saturn can present challenges, but that can be mitigated by its strong position. And Saturn, for this person, is in an exalted position, and that should lead to a good result in this person's case, and that is true. This person achieved a high-ranking position during Saturn's Antardasha. I'll reveal the identity of this person at the end of this video. Now, even though Saturn might have created some challenges in certain aspects of this person's life, the person was also able to experience the best of Saturn, and Saturn is exalted in this person's case, and holding a high-ranking public office is a very Saturn-like event to happen. Now, which aspects of this person's life would have been impacted by Saturn's position? Now, this is the methodology that I follow. I look at Saturn's position, I look at the houses Saturn or any Dasha planet is aspecting, and then I look at the houses this planet is ruling. Now, Saturn in this person's case is ruling the 4th and the 5th house, which is related to personal life and relationship with children, which might have been impacted due to gain of this high-ranking position. Saturn is having an impact on the 7th house as well, which is personal life related. So every coin has an opposite side. Even though this person achieved a high-ranking position, I'm sure due to Saturn's influence on the 4th, 5th and the 7th, the person's personal life might have been impacted, in which has been the case based on my research on this person's life. This is a birth chart of a famous person whose identity I would reveal at the end. Then what I study is Saturn's position in the Navamsha and the Dasamsha, and here I find Saturn ruling the 10th house in both the charts. So in the Navamsha and the Dasamsha, I'm looking for patterns. In the main chart, I find Saturn aspecting the 10th house. In the Navamsha and the Dasamsha, I find Saturn ruling the 10th house. So it's very likely during Saturn's Antardasha, given Saturn's exalted position in this person's case, this person might be given a high-ranking position. So you combine your findings from the Navamsha and the Dasamsha, and then you relate that to the main chart, and then try to analyze what might unfold. This is the methodology that I follow. I am going to be sharing, as I mentioned earlier, favorable and unfavorable events related to every planet. What might be most helpful for you to understand how to assess whether the upcoming dasha is going to be favorable or not. How do you do that? Now, these are the few combinations I study. Firstly, naturally, if the Antardasha is of Mars, Saturn, Rahu and Ketu in particular, there are likely to be some challenges. Secondly, if these planets, if you're entering the Antardasha of these planets, if they are placed in the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, first, that might lead to complications. If you are about to enter Rahu's Antardasha and you find Rahu in the 8th house, you can expect some unfavorable events to unfold, and then you can wait till the end of Saturn's Antardasha to recover from that change. The second thing you must analyze is the relationship between the houses the Dasha planet is ruling and the house it's occupying. If the relationship is 6, 8 or 12, there's a high possibility during its Dasha you're likely to encounter some challenges. What I mean by that is, if let's say the 7th house ruler is Jupiter and it's placed in the 12th house. So from the 7th house, the 12th house is 6 places away. It's likely during Jupiter's Antardasha the person might face some challenges related to the 7th house. Maybe the couple have to separate temporarily as one of them has to go abroad for work. So some challenge might be there, which are linked to the 12th house and to the 7th house. That's how you analyze it. Thirdly, you must study the relationship between the Mahadasha planet and the Antardasha planet. If you're going through the Mahadasha of Sun and the Antardasha of Saturn, it's very likely you're going to face some challenges, particularly from authority figures, given the difficult relationship Sun and Saturn share with one another. This is where you must understand the basics of astrology to understand relationships planets share with one another. You can go to the first article on the blog of Far Far Away and study this friendship table. The fourth thing you can do is to see the relationship between the position of the Mahadasha planet, house position, and the house position of the Antardasha planet. Again, same example, Sun and Saturn. If, for example, Sun is placed in the 10th house and Saturn is placed in the 3rd house, it's likely this is going to be a difficult time. Firstly, as Sun and Saturn share a difficult relationship, and secondly, Saturn is placed 6 places away from Sun. Sun's position is 10th, Saturn's position is 6 places away in the 3rd house. So I've now listed 4 set of combinations which might help you identify if the Antardasha, the current or the upcoming one, is going to be favorable for you or unfavorable. That's how I read dashas. You can also take into account the transits. Now, if you go back to the example I had taken earlier, in this person's case, even though Saturn can cause challenges, given Saturn's strong position, the person gained a high-ranking position, and at the time when that person was granted that high-ranking position, Saturn was transiting the 11th house and the nakshatra Purva Phalguni. That position also indicates fulfillment of one's desires, as that's what Purva Phalguni is about, and also the 11th house. So you can also study the transits alongside the dashas. But any life event that has to take place, it has been my experience, it has to be approved by the dashas. So now I'm going to be sharing for different planets favorable and unfavorable positions. I'm going to be talking about certain nakshatras and signs where they are favorable, and then I'm going to be listing favorable and unfavorable events associated with those planets. So you can simply study, okay, I'm about to enter Venus's Antardasha. Venus is favorably placed in my chart, so what possibly can I expect? So Mars, if you're going through the dasha of Mars, or you're about to enter the dasha of Mars, when I refer to dasha, it can be the Mahadasha, the Antardasha, and the Pratyantardasha. I find the Antardasha to be the most important one, as they are behind important life stories like marriage, progress in our career, etc. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to go through the list of nakshatras and share my opinion if I find Mars to be strong or weak in that position. Actually, if Mars's position is strong, you're very likely to experience a favorable event. Favorable or unfavorable, the list of events I'm also going to share with you. So let's begin with Mars's position. Mars in Ashwini does really well. This is the first nakshatra. Mars has an excellent relationship with Ketu, and the sign is Aries. So Ashwini, Aries, this is a good position for Mars. Even in the nakshatra of Bharani, which falls in the same sign, the sign of Aries, Mars is doing well, as it's sharing a friendly relationship with Venus. At least it's not a relationship of enmity. Now in Kritika, Mars does well if it falls in the sign of Aries, as here Mars is amongst friends. Kritika is ruled by Sun and the sign of Aries is ruled by Mars. I think it does less well in the sign of Taurus. I'm not sure Mars is in a strong position in the nakshatra of Rohini, as it's in the sign ruled by Venus. Yes, but the nakshatra of Rohini is ruled by Moon, and Mars doesn't share a very strong friendship with Moon. I think Mars does well in Mrigashira, the nakshatra it is ruling. The sign is Taurus. I think it does well. I don't think Mars does well in the nakshatra of Mrigashira, which falls in the sign of Gemini, as Gemini's planetary ruler is Mercury, and Mars dislikes Mercury. That's the best way of putting it. Mars also doesn't have a good relationship with Rahu. I don't think Mars does well in the nakshatra of Ardra, which falls entirely in the sign of Gemini, ruled by Mercury. Mars, I don't think, does well in Punarvasu either, if it falls in the sign of Gemini. However, if Mars is in the nakshatra of Punarvasu, which is in the sign of Cancer, I think it does reasonably well. I think Mars has a better relationship with Moon, which is ruling the sign of Cancer, than Mercury. I don't think Mars does well in the nakshatra of Pushya. I think it's in the sign ruled by Moon, which is not a great position, but Pushya's planetary ruler is Saturn, and Mars does not have a friendly relationship with Saturn. Now Mars is the weakest in the nakshatra of Ashlesha, which falls in the sign of Cancer, ruled by Moon, which I have been sharing. Mars does not share a great relationship with. And Mars is also in the nakshatra ruled by Mercury, and Mars dislikes Mercury. So Mars in Ashlesha is a difficult position. So if you are about to enter Mars's Maha or Antardasha and you find Mars in Ashlesha, you can face some challenges and you just have to be strong. With this position, the person may find oneself making an effort for something, but the efforts might be constantly frustrated due to one thing or the other. Mars does well, I think, in the nakshatra of Magha, which falls in the sign of Leo, ruled by Sun. Sun and Magha's ruler Ketu together, they have a friendly relationship with Mars. Mars does well even in the nakshatra of Purva Phalguni and in the first pada of Uttar Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Leo. I don't think Mars does well in the nakshatra of Uttar Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Virgo. Although Mars in Hasta is a strong position, the person can be highly skillful, but the environment for Mars is of Mercury and Moon, which can lead to a difficult position for Mars. And I think even if the nakshatra is Chitra, which falls in this sign, still Mars may not do very well. However, if the nakshatra is Chitra and the sign is Libra, Mars is likely to do better. Mars, I don't think, does well in the nakshatra Swati. I think Swati's planetary ruler Rahu. I think Mars lacks direction here in the nakshatra Swati, and I think that I also say with Mars's position there in Ashlesha, Mars is very goal oriented, and in the nakshatra of Ashlesha the person might feel that they have a goal but they just don't know how to achieve it. Path is highly convoluted due to the nature of the nakshatra of Ashlesha. Mars does well, I think, in the nakshatra of Vishakha. Given the environment of Venus and Jupiter, it does well, even better, I guess, in the sign of Scorpio. Mars does reasonably well in the nakshatra of Anuradha. The person can be a good researcher as Mars gets the company of Saturn and learns to be more patient, and the sign is ruled by itself. Now, even though the nakshatra of Jyeshta falls entirely in the sign of Scorpio, ruled by Mars, I don't think Mars does very well here, as the nakshatra of Jyeshta is ruled by Mercury and Mars is not sharing the best relationship, although the person is likely to be an excellent researcher. And the same I'd say about Mars's position in Mula, which is in the environment of Jupiter and Ketu. The environment of Jupiter, Sagittarius, is ruled by Jupiter. The nakshatra is ruled by Ketu. Mars does well in Purva Shadha and Uttara Shadha, friendly environments. Don't think it does well in the nakshatra of Shravana. It struggles to deal with the emotional side attached to the nakshatra of Shravana, given its planetary ruler is Moon. Although it's not a difficult position, it doesn't do as well as it does in other sections. Now, Mars is at its best in the nakshatra of Dhanishta. Here it gets Saturn's energy. Saturn brings that discipline and organization into Martian goals, and this nakshatra entirely is ruled by Mars. So Mars does very, very well. Even though Mars does better or is the strongest in the nakshatra Dhanishta, Mars in Ashlesha kind of a person can be an excellent strategic planner, a risk manager, a lawyer, or even a spy. Mars in Shatabesha, I don't think Mars does very well. Although the person can be an excellent researcher, work can be highly scientific, Mars does well in the nakshatra Purva Bhadapada and Uttar Bhadapada, given the friendly environment of Jupiter and Saturn, particularly that of Jupiter. I don't think it does well in the nakshatra of Revati, but the person can be a yoga teacher where one is combining physical movements with a philosophy of some kind. Now, if Mars is favorably placed based on its position, based on the summary I've shared with you just now, and you find Mars is not having a relationship with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, based on the combinations I had shared earlier in the methodology, you can go back there, then you are likely to experience the following favorable events under Mars's Dasha: attainment of a high administrative or political position, a commander's role of some kind. The person is likely to grow in strength, physical strength in particular. Wealth can be earned through struggle and through sustained effort. The person can also be able to win over enemies, and that might lead to gain in income, gain in wealth, recovery of a lost kingdom. That's very important, or lost wealth, or reinstatement of a high position, construction of a home, particularly if Mars is having a relationship with the fourth house, or Saturn, gain of land, ownership of properties, increase in productivity, which is also, I think, linked to growth in strength, physical strength in particular, success all around. The person can also be very profitable in business. Again, it has to do with that entrepreneurial spirit, the courage and determination one might encounter if Mars is strongly placed and the person is going through Mars's Antardasha. Advancement of fortune, the person can continue a good fortune and maintain that. Person, this is important, might actually dwell in a foreign country. Gain of wealth in a foreign country is also linked to Mars. Birth of a son, warmth of male members of the family, particularly help from one's brother, can be experienced under Mars's Antardasha. And then even marriage is linked, but not strongly linked, with Mars. Now, if you have found Mars to be in an unfavorable position based on the nakshatra and sign it's occupying, and in addition to that you've also find Mars's association with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, you're likely to, under Mars's Dasha, encounter loss of position, a loss of wealth, unnecessary expenses, extravagant spending, losses of work, failure in business, loss of wealth by the displeasure of the king. That might lead to you being asked to pay a penalty by the government. From that to something more dramatic, the person can experience lack of peace of mind and can become highly temperamental. A loss of home can lead to going away to a foreign land. The person may also experience loss of productivity. Issues during foreign journey. The person can also enter into quarrels with male members of the family, particularly one's brother. This quarrel can also be with one's life partner, particularly if Venus is involved. You might even become dependent on others if Saturn is involved. If the Mahadasha is of Saturn, the Antardasha is of Mars, Mars isn't strongly placed, then you might feel lack of independence. You might find yourself also getting injured. You have to be mindful of that. And the person can also be fearful of death. Under very extreme circumstances, the person can also be imprisoned. Well, that is all that is associated with Mars. You must closely analyze where Mars is placed in your chart, and if you find it to be strongly placed, you can expect favorable events, and if it's weakly placed, then you can guard yourself against some of the unfavorable events that I've listed down for you. Now let's do Saturn. Now Saturn does not do well in the first sign. In fact, it's debilitated in the sign of Aries. So in all three nakshatras, Saturn is weak. I think Saturn dislikes this Martian energy. I think Saturn prefers planning things out before executing them, whereas this Martian energy is very spontaneous. And there's also a bit of mythology behind the nakshatra of Bharani in particular, where it's debilitated as its ruler is Lord Yama, and the relationship Saturn shares with Lord Yama is a difficult one. So for more than one reason, Saturn is weak. In the nakshatra of Kritika, the one which falls in the sign of Aries, it's weak. I think it does better if it's in the sign of Taurus. Saturn and Venus are very friendly. So Saturn does better in Kritika if it falls in the sign of Taurus. I don't think Saturn does well in the nakshatra of Rohini, neither does it do well in the nakshatra of Mrigashira. It does well now in the nakshatra of Adra. This is the first nakshatra from the list from the beginning that I find Saturn doing well in, as it's in the nakshatra ruled by Rahu, which Saturn considers as a friend, and it also does well in the sign of Gemini, as Gemini's planetary ruler is Mercury, and Saturn finds Mercury to be a friend. It does well even in Punavasu. It's in a friendly environment of Jupiter and Mercury. It doesn't do well in the sign of Cancer. It doesn't share a great relationship with Moon or Sun, and therefore I don't think Saturn does well in all the nakshatras which are falling in the sign of Cancer or Leo, which are Punavasu, the last pada, Pushya, Ashlesha, Magha, Purva, Falguni. And even in the sign of Virgo, Saturn doesn't do well in my view, as in the sign of Virgo, the nakshatras which are there are nakshatras ruled by Sun, Moon and Mars, and all three of them Saturn considers as unfriendly. Saturn begins to do very well in the sign of Libra, in particular starting from the nakshatra of Swati. Even the nakshatras of Chitra, which are falling in the sign of Libra, I think Saturn does okay, but I think does very well in the nakshatra of Swati. Swati's planetary ruler is Rahu, and the friendly relationship between the two is the reason behind this strong position. Saturn does very well in the very first pada of Vishakha. Here Saturn gets Venus's support. Saturn and Venus are best friends, and it gets the guidance from Jupiter. Vishakha's planetary ruler is Jupiter. So this is where the best of Saturn is experienced. And if you remember the example I shared, Saturn for that person was in Vishakha. I think Saturn does okay in the last pada of Vishakha, which falls in the sign of Scorpio, and it does reasonably okay in the nakshatra of Anuradha, falling in the sign of Scorpio, as Anuradha's planetary ruler is Saturn itself. Saturn Jyeshta is okay. I think the person can be a good researcher, although I won't say this is a strong position for Saturn, and the same I'd say for Saturn in Mula. Saturn does well now, I think, in Purva Shadha. It's a friendly environment of Jupiter and Venus. Saturn, I don't think, does well in the first pada of Uttara Ashadha, which falls in the sign of Sagittarius, as Uttara Ashadha's planetary ruler is Sun. Saturn begins to do okay, is going to give mixed results in the nakshatra of Uttara Ashadha, Shravana and Dhanishta. Even though these nakshatras are ruled by Sun, Moon and Mars respectively, the environment is of Saturn. Capricorn exclusively is ruled by Saturn. So mixed results, but on the balance I think Saturn would do well. Saturn does very well in the nakshatra of Shatabisha. Saturn in Rahu's environment, it does very well, I think, even in Purva Bhadapada, and it does well in the nakshatras of Uttara Bhadapada and Revati, less so, I think, than the nakshatras I had mentioned. So this is broadly my opinion of how Saturn might do in different nakshatras. Now, if you find Saturn well placed based on its nakshatra and sign, and it's not associated with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, you're likely to experience favorable events under Saturn's Dasha. Now, what are those favorable events? Pleasure of king for devotion in service, and for that the person can be given a very high ranking position, attainment of national prominence, recognition and favors from the government, gains from high-ranking government officials, good news from one's employer, profits in business with the help of people who are service providers, gain of property, construction of a garden, marriage is a possibility under Saturn. For example, if Venus is involved, the person is going to Saturn's Mahadasha and Venus's Antardasha. This, in my experience, has been a very promising time. I've seen people getting married in. Increase in responsibility, so birth of a child, happiness from children and grandchildren, success in education, particularly if it's research driven, defeat of enemies. The person might be in a long fight with someone, and if Saturn's Dasha is going on and Saturn is strongly placed, the person can win over such battles. The pleasure of literary discussions, increase in productivity, those are some Saturn related favorable events, mainly to do with being given a position of high power by someone more powerful. Now, if Saturn isn't strongly placed in your chart and Saturn is associated with the 6th, 8th and the 12th house, you might encounter trouble as a result of displeasure of the government. You may find yourself on the wrong side of law, loss of position, reputation, defamation. You might have to resign from an existing position, obstacles and losses in ventures, loss of wealth due to government fines, for example. In particular, again, issues with government would be part of your journey. More expenses than income, reduction in income due to lethargy. The person can fall prey to laziness, mental agony, loss of thinking power, particularly if Mercury is involved, loss of one's place of residence, loss from a sale of property, inauspicious events at home which leads to a gloomy atmosphere, return to homeland. The person might be asked to come back to one's home country, or circumstances might be such that the person has to do that. Journey to foreign lands where you have to do so as a duty rather than wanting to do it for leisure. Danger from foreign governments is also a possibility. Failure of efforts, the person can also encounter enemies and diseases. You may even enter legal fights. There's likely to be stress in one's life due to one's father, perhaps due to father's health, father's career, or other reasons. The person in some extreme cases can become extremely fearful of misfortune and may even be imprisoned. In extreme cases, the person can get injured very badly. There can also be danger from thieves, not only in one's home, but also whilst traveling. And the person might also not have good food to eat during Saturn's chapter. If you are going through Saturn's Dasha, particularly its Antardasha, and you're finding it difficult, you have discovered in your chart Saturn is not strongly placed, then you must remain patient. Every story has an ending. From the table you can find out when this Saturn's Antardasha is going to end. And a helpful Pratyantardasha, time period 3, might also help you deal with the challenges Saturn has posed in your life. So let's do Jupiter. If you're about to enter its Dasha, or you're currently going through it, Jupiter does reasonably well in the nakshatra of Ashwini, as it falls in the sign of Aries, has a friendly relationship, particularly with Mars. It's okay in Bharani. I'd say it's going to give you mixed results. It does very well in the nakshatra of Kritika, which falls in the sign of Aries. I don't think it does very well in any of the nakshatras which are falling in the sign of Taurus, which are Kritika, Rohini, or Mrigashira, as Jupiter does not consider Venus to be a friend. Jupiter, I don't think, is also going to do very well in all the nakshatras which are falling in the sign of Gemini, as its planetary ruler is Mercury, and Jupiter does not also consider Mercury as a friend. Although these positions are going to give mixed results, I wouldn't say these positions are strong positions. Jupiter in Mrigashira, for example, in Gemini, can lead to someone being an excellent public speaker. Jupiter Ardra could lead to someone very well informed about different languages. Jupiter in Punarvasu, I think, is the strongest position Jupiter is occupying in the sign of Gemini, as Punarvasu is ruled by Jupiter. The person may have a great understanding of business in this position with Jupiter in Punarvasu. Jupiter does very well in the sign of Cancer. In the last pada of Punarvasu, which falls in the sign of Cancer, Jupiter now does very well in the nakshatra of Pushya, which falls in the sign of Cancer. Jupiter is exalted in Pushya. And there's also mythology, as Pushya's ruler is Lord Brihaspati, and Jupiter is known to be the planetary form of Lord Brihaspati. So Jupiter, if it's placed in the nakshatra of Pushya in your chart, it's going to do very well. Jupiter in Ashlesha, I don't think does very well due to Jupiter's unfriendly relationship with Mercury. Jupiter does well in Magha, friendly relations with Sun and Ketu. Doesn't do very well in Purva Phalguni, although the person can be not only very well educated, but at the same time very creative. So it's a common ground that a person might reach between education and creativity in Purva Phalguni. It does well in Uttara Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Leo. I don't think it does well in Uttara Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Virgo, as it's ruled by Mercury, and Jupiter does not, as I've been saying, share a great relationship with Mercury. And for that reason, in the remainder of the nakshatras which are in Virgo, namely Hasta, Chitra, Jupiter doesn't do well. Jupiter, I don't think, would do very well in the sign of Libra. In all the nakshatras, Chitra, Swati, and Vishaka, although amongst these three I think it's going to do the best in the nakshatra Vishaka, as it's ruling that section of the sky. Jupiter does very well in the sign of Scorpio. It's in a friendly environment, does well in Vishaka. It does very well in the nakshatra of Anuradha. I'll even go on to say Jupiter Anuradha is the best possible combination for researchers and even astrologers or any research-driven career. Jupiter Anuradha is a very strong position for them. Jupiter in Jyeshtha does reasonably well, although Jupiter might be caught up between philosophy and leadership. It's an okay position, a mixed position. Jupiter does well in Mula. People make excellent researchers, just like Jupiter in Anuradha. Jupiter Purvashadha, mixed results. The person can be caught up between serving the society through knowledge versus making a name for oneself, so it's a mixed position. Jupiter does okay in Uttarashadha when it falls in the sign of Sagittarius, but it's debilitated in Uttarashadha if it falls in the sign of Capricorn, as Jupiter is caught up in the idea of either serving the society through knowledge or doing things for the purpose of making a name, and therefore Jupiter is uncomfortable in this position. Jupiter is weak even in Shravana, in the same sign, the sign of Capricorn, even in Dhanishta, which falls in the sign of Capricorn. I think Jupiter begins to do well in Aquarius. It does reasonably okay in Dhanishta. In Shatabisha and Purvabhadapada, in the sign of Aquarius, I think it does very well. It does very well in the sign of Pisces. In Purvabhadapada and Uttabhadapada, I don't think it does very well in the nakshatra of Revati, although the person can be very philosophical with this position. If Jupiter is favorably placed in your chart, you're likely to be given a high-ranking position under its dasha. You're likely to be entrusted with authority of any kind, whether it's administrative or political. You are likely to be recognized not just by one king, but by many kings. So you might be seen as a source of guidance by people occupying positions of authority in the society. Name and fame, good reputation, dawn of fortune, great increase in wealth, fulfillment of desires, success in ventures. You might have many people serving you. Foreign travel is strongly linked to Jupiter. Higher education, I myself have done an MBA under Jupiter's Antardasha, and during Jupiter's chapter you're likely to be very inclined towards learning the Vedas and the Puranas, devotion to deities, religious mindedness, inclination towards charitable and religious activities, worship of Lord Shiva, success in religious sacrifices, involvement in good deeds, gain of land and property, buying of costly vehicles, recovery of a lost position, sound health. You might be able to overcome your enemies, celebrations or auspicious functions at one's home, particularly in the case of women, it can be marriage, happiness in one's married life, birth of a son, and the pleasure of good food. Those are some of the events that might unfold under Jupiter's chapter. If Jupiter is unfavorably placed and is associated with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, you're likely to be separated from your teacher, your guru. You might face the displeasure of your teachers. You might have lack of guidance in life, loss of position, defamation, loss of wealth in job or in business, loss of productivity, obstacles at work, prosecution by the government, unscrupulous acquisition of assets. You might resort to using unfair means to gain. Going away to foreign lands here, it may not be for the purpose of leisure. It might be due to loss of home or one's residence, loss of servants, unpalatable food, issues with male members of the family, danger from thieves and snakes, and suffering in one's personal life. These are some events that you might encounter if Jupiter is unfavorably placed. Now, since Jupiter is a natural benefic, it's less likely some of these events are going to be too dramatic. Let's study Venus's position in your chart. Now, in Ashwini, it's not a strong position for Venus, It's in a neutral sign, the sign of Aries, and a neutral nakshatra ruler, Ketu. I think it does much better in the nakshatra of Bharani, as Venus now is in the section of the sky ruled by itself. Venus doesn't do well in Kritika, which is in the sign of Aries. It doesn't do well even if it falls in the sign of Taurus. I think it would give mixed results, as the nakshatra of Kritika is ruled by Sun, and Venus considers Sun and Moon to be on the unfriendly side, and therefore Venus doesn't do well even in the nakshatra of Rohini. Venus does well in the nakshatra of Mrigashira, which falls in the sign of Taurus. Taurus is naturally ruled by itself, and Mrigashira is ruled by Mars, which it doesn't consider unfriendly. So far, Venus does very well in Bharani and in Mrigashira. Even in the sign of Gemini, Venus and Mercury share an excellent relationship. So Venus does very well in Gemini, in the nakshatra of Mrigashira, and in the nakshatra of Ardra. Ardra's planetary ruler is Rahu, and Venus and Rahu share a very friendly relationship. The last nakshatra in Gemini is Punarvasu, and since Punarvasu's ruler is Jupiter, Venus isn't well placed here. There's two opposing opinions now. Venus is on one side, who is the planetary form of Lord Shukracharya, whereas Jupiter is the planetary form of Lord Brihaspati, and their teachers who are on the opposing side. So therefore this can be a difficult position for Venus, but nothing dramatic. Venus and Jupiter inherently are positive forces, and therefore nothing can be too difficult here. But it's all relative. I think Venus does a bit better, I think, in the nakshatras I've shared so far. Bharani and Ardra and Mrigashira. Venus, I don't think, does well in the environment ruled by Moon or by Sun. So all these nakshatras, Pushya, Ashlesha, Magha and Purva Falguni, I don't think Venus is doing very well in. Although naturally in Purva Falguni, Venus is ruling that section of the sky. Venus is going to do well there, but the person can be excessively proud of one's achievements, one's creative skills in particular. So therefore it has a positive and a negative side to that position, so mixed results there. Venus, I don't think, does well in the sign of Virgo. It's actually debilitated in the sign of Virgo, so all these nakshatras, Uttara Falguni, Hasta and Chitra, it doesn't do very well in. Venus is debilitated in the nakshatra of Chitra, which falls in the sign of Virgo. I think Venus's unhinged and unending creative energy is met with boundaries in the nakshatra of Chitra. That's the nature of the nakshatra of Chitra, and therefore Venus, in my view, doesn't do well in this section of the sky. Venus does well in the sign of Libra. If it falls in the sign of Libra, Venus does well in Chitra, but not in the sign of Virgo. Venus does well in Swati. I think the person can be extremely social and may do very well at jobs that require those social skills, and the person might have company of people from all over the world, so the person might have exposure to different cultures. Venus doesn't do very well in the nakshatra of Vishaka. Again, those opposing views might be seen in the person's life. Venus is doing well in the sign of Scorpio. Scorpio's planetary ruler is Mars. Mars and Venus have a neutral relationship. It does well in the nakshatra of Anuradha, whose planetary ruler is Saturn. Venus and Saturn share a good relationship. Venus would do well even in the nakshatra of Jyeshta. But under this sign of Scorpio, the person is likely to encounter relationship-related issues, as that's the nature of the sign of Scorpio. Venus in Sagittarius, in the nakshatra of Mula, I don't think it's going to do well. It's going to do reasonably okay in Purva Shadha, but again the person might have a conflict between wanting to make a name for oneself or educating the world. So there are these opposing views that the person might have to face. Venus, I don't think, does well in Uttara Shadha entirely, as it considers Sun as unfriendly, and neither does it do very well in the nakshatra of Shravana. It starts to do well again in the sign of Capricorn under the nakshatra of Dhanishta, and in the nakshatra Shatabisha. Here Venus is finding itself in a friendly environment. It doesn't do well in Purva Bhadapada. It does start to do well in Uttabhadapada, particularly in the last sign, the sign of Pisces, where Venus is exalted. In fact, in the very last pada, Venus is exalted, where it finds itself under Mercury and Jupiter's environment. I think Venus finally understands Jupiter's purpose here, and therefore the opposing views are no longer as opposing, and there's a common ground there which is reached in this nakshatra. Now, if you're finding Venus to be strongly placed in your chart, the possibility of marriage under Venus's dasha is very, very, very strong. It doesn't matter how strong Venus is, if it's directly or even indirectly linked to the 7th house under Venus's Antardasha in particular, the probability of marriage is going to be very, very high. Venus also brings festivity at home, celebrations of all kind, rise in income, extraordinary gains in business, advancement of good fortune, name and fame, recognition, attainment of a high position, again to do with making a name for oneself, recovery of lost wealth, property, kingdom, reinstatement of a high position. So under Venus's Antardasha, the person can also recover from a setback, buying of a house, construction of a new house. So if you already have a house, you may go and extend your assets, comforts of costly vehicles. The person can become extremely creative. Venus would also create an interest in Vedas and Shastras. The person might also build a relationship with people who are religious minded. So this religious mindedness might also be part of the person's journey. The person may also visit sacred shrines. Both Jupiter and Venus's dasha would create a strong interest in religion. The person under Venus in particular may also have an interest in the occult. The person can become extremely charitable, sound health, birth of children and grandchildren, or increase in children. The person can have another child under Venus's Antardasha. Discovery of hidden talents under Venus, you might discover them. Help from friends, fulfillment of desires, simply a life full of delight can be experienced under Venus's chapter. If Venus in your life is weak and Venus is associated with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, you're likely to encounter the following events. Issues in personal life, married life can be affected. I have seen that if the relationship between the Mahadasha and the Antardasha planet is 6, 8 or 12, and the Antardasha planet is Venus, for example, the person going through Rahu's Mahadasha and Venus is Antardasha, and Venus is 6, 8 or 12 places away from Rahu, and Venus furthermore is weakly placed, the person can encounter difficulty in personal life, loss of position, defamation, loss of wealth, persecution by the king, fines and penalties, deportation to a foreign land, loss of house, loss of comforts, difficult relations with family members, quarrels without cause, eye trouble can also be part of your journey. Venus signifies vision. The person can also have some danger of drowning or falling from a tree, and the person can also become fearful, mainly to do with loss of what the person has built. That is something you can encounter if Venus is not strongly placed in your chart. Let's do Mercury now. Mercury I find to be reasonably placed in the nakshatra of Ashwini. I wouldn't say it's a favorable position for Mercury. That's largely due to the relationship it shares with Mars, which isn't very friendly, and for the same reason I'd say it's not very well placed in the nakshatra of Bharani, as it falls in the sign of Aries ruled by Mars. Although I think it's likely to do better in Bharani than in Ashwini, as Bharani's planetary ruler is Venus, and for the same reason I think it does well even in Kritika than in Ashwini in the sign of Aries, as it has a better relationship with the nakshatra ruler. Now if Kritika falls in the sign of Taurus, I think Mercury does very well, as it finds itself amongst friends, Venus and Sun. I think it doesn't do well in Rohini, The person can be very creative and might express one's creative talents through words, but it doesn't share a good relationship with Moon, and therefore I don't think it does really well in Rohini, and neither does it do very well in Mrigashira, irrespective of the sign, whether Taurus or Gemini, although naturally it's likely to do better in the sign of Gemini, which it's ruling in Mrigashira. It does very well, in my view, in the nakshatra of Ardha. In my experience, I've met people who are familiar with multiple languages, having Mercury there in Ardha. It has a neutral relationship with Rahu. Naturally, it feels very comfortable in the sign of Gemini. It does well in the nakshatra of Punarvasu. It's under Jupiter's guidance in its own sign. I think this is an excellent position if the person wants to build one's career, which is advisory, consultancy, or counseling in particular. I don't think it does well in the sign of Cancer, given its difficult relationship it has with Moon. So all the nakshatras, Punarvasu, Pushya and Ashlesha, which are falling in the sign of Cancer, I don't think it's doing very well, although in the nakshatra of Ashlesha, this is an excellent position if a person wants to build one's career in psychology. It does reasonably well in the sign of Leo, and it does, I think, better in Purva Falguni and Uttara Falguni than in Magha. It does excellent in the sign of Virgo. The nakshatras which are falling here in Uttara Falguni, it's doing very well. In Hasta, it does very, very well. This is the position where Mercury is exalted. I think Mercury here learns how to harness its intellect productively, and the person becomes highly skillful and intelligent and highly analytical. So the best of Mercury, in my view, is experienced in the nakshatra of Hasta. And here I think, since this nakshatra is ruled by Moon, the person can use one's intellect as a form of therapy in some ways. Mercury does better if Chitra falls in the sign of Virgo than in Libra. I think it does well in the nakshatra Swati. The environment is friendly. I don't think it's doing as well in Vishakha or in the nakshatra of Anuradha, given its not so friendly relationship with Saturn in particular, which is ruling the nakshatra of Anuradha. It's going to give you mixed results in Vishakha, irrespective of the sign. I think it does better in the sign of Libra than in the sign of Scorpio, if we are talking about Vishakha. In Jyeshtha, it does very well, even though the sign is ruled by Mars. But Jyeshtha's planetary ruler is Mercury itself. This is an excellent position for a person wanting to build one's career, for example, in the field of research. The same I'd say with Mula. Excellent researcher, although I think Mercury is much stronger in Jyeshtha than in Mula. I think it does reasonably okay in the nakshatra of Purva Ashadha. The environment is friendly, of Venus in particular. In Uttara Ashadha, Mercury does reasonably well, as it considers Jupiter and Saturn as a neutral, and it has a friendly relationship with Sun, which is ruling this nakshatra, Uttara Ashadha. I don't think Mercury does very well in Shravana, given Shravana's ruler is Moon. It's likely to give mixed results in the nakshatra of Dhanishta, and even in the nakshatra Shatabesha, Purva Bhadapada and Uttara Bhadapada, given the environment, I find Mercury placed here as highly mixed. Mercury is debilitated in the nakshatra of Uttara Bhadapada, as it finds itself in the environment of Jupiter and Saturn, both of which Mercury does not consider as unfriendly, but given the nature of the nakshatra of Uttara Bhadapada, which is to accept responsibility and guidance rather than business, I think Mercury finds itself doing things Mercury is not good at, and therefore I think Mercury is debilitated here. Mercury does very well in the last nakshatra which it rules. The person with this position can become an excellent counselor, or might express one's creative talents through words through some medium. Now, if you find Mercury in your chart well placed, these are the favorable events that might unfold. Gain of knowledge, skill-based education is very Mercury related. Getting in touch with experts, the person may naturally find oneself getting in touch with people who have more experience in whatever you're trying to learn. Success in education sphere, so if you're writing exams or preparing for one, this is an excellent time to study. Business is directly linked to Mercury, so starting a business, I myself have started far away under Mercury's Antardasha. You're likely to also be able to turn your business into profits if Mercury is well placed. Fulfillment of ambitions, gain of reputation, name and fame, although not directly linked to Mercury, can be an outcome of your efforts. The person may also become very interested in the Vedas and the Puranas. You may also find yourself reciting mantras. That's very Mercury related activity. The person may also find oneself discussing religious scriptures, or the person may simply start learning more about ancient sciences. The entire story section that you find on Far Away, the first draft I compiled during Mercury's Antardasha. So I myself found studying the Vedas during the time I was under Mercury's Antardasha, so I've personally experienced some of these events. The person can get into love affairs, particularly if Mercury is ruling the 5th house. The person can also turn very charitable, inspired by the Vedas. Inclination towards music, if Venus is also involved. The person can also build close relations with people who occupy authority in the society. So those are some favorable events. Now, if you find Mercury not strongly placed in your chart, and you find Mercury's association with the 6th, 8th, or the 12th house, it's likely that you might lose favor from the government. You may have a conflict with government officials. You might also be penalized by the government. You might also suffer from stress and anxiety. The person can also become angry easily, particularly if Sun and Mars is also involved. The person can also turn very fearful of misfortune. The person may also succumb to sinful thinking and can start telling lies or get into arguments and quarrels. The person may also experience loss in business, loss of wealth due to overspending, loss of enjoyments and comforts, loss of land, wandering in a foreign land aimlessly, and dependence on others and residing in other people's home can also be experienced under Mercury's chapter. Increase in enemies. The person can also build difficult relations with people who are one's business partners, for example. So those are all Mercury related events that might unfold. Let's do the next one. Right, let's do Sun now. Sun does very well in the nakshatra, the very first nakshatra of Ashwini. In fact, it's exalted in this section of the sky. The healing quality associated with Ashwini, and also Sun representing good health. That's mythology also explaining why Sun is exalted in this section of the sky. It also has a very friendly relationship with Mars. I don't think it does as well in the same sign, but in the nakshatra of Bharani. I think it does better in Kritika. In the sign of Taurus, it finds itself in an unfriendly environment of Venus, and so I don't think it does well even if it's in the nakshatra of Kritika ruled by itself. There's likely to be some Venus related issues. For example, you are occupying a position of authority, but it's affecting your relations with your colleagues. It also, for the same reason, does not do very well in Rohini. The person, however, can be very creative. In Mrigashira, I think it does better in the sign of Gemini than in the sign of Taurus. I think it has a more friendly relationship with Mercury. Mercury considers Sun as a friend. Now, Sun isn't very comfortable in the foreign environment of Ardra, and so I wouldn't say it's a favorable position for Sun. Sun does very well in Punarvasu, more so in the sign of Cancer, but also in the sign of Gemini. I don't think Sun will do well in the nakshatra of Pushya, given its difficult relationship with Saturn. Sun does reasonably well in the nakshatra of Ashlesha. The environment is friendly, although the purpose of Ashlesha and Sun are different. Ashlesha is defined as having a caste of an outcast. The person can be a leader of an activity which doesn't conform to societal norms in some ways. Sun does very, very well in the nakshatra of Magha. In a way, the sign of Leo, the nakshatra of Magha and Sun are all linked to leadership, and therefore I think Sun finds itself in a very, very strong position, not only in Magha but even in the nakshatra of Purva Phalguni, falling in the same sign. It does even better, I believe, in Uttara Phalguni than in Purva Phalguni, as here Uttara Phalguni is ruled by Sun itself. Now Uttara Phalguni, even if it falls in the sign of Virgo, Sun does very well as it enjoys the company of Mercury. Sun does well in Hasta and Chitra again for the same reason, given the environment of Mercury is friendly. Sun doesn't do well in the sign of Libra due to its difficult relationship with Venus, and particularly in the nakshatra Swati. Here Swati's planetary ruler is Rahu, and Sun finds itself dealing with individuals who might be foreign to Sun. Sun is the king. The king is always in touch with people who are familiar to the king. But when Sun is asked to build relations with other people as an equal, and those people are foreign, Sun finds itself in a difficult position, and therefore I think Sun doesn't do well in Swati. Neither does it do well in Vishakha, although in Vishakha it finds itself in a better position than in Swati. It does better if Vishakha falls in the sign of Scorpio. Here it gets Martian support. I don't think it does very well in the nakshatra of Anuradha, although with Sun in Anuradha the person is likely to be a public servant, a government worker of some kind. Sun does well in the nakshatra of Jyeshta. It finds itself in a friendly environment. Sun entirely in the sign of Sagittarius is going to give you mixed results, as the first nakshatra of Mula finds itself in an unfriendly environment of Ketu, and also later in Purvashadha in an unfriendly environment of Venus, although it does well in the last nakshatra falling in the sign of Sagittarius, which is of Uttarashadha. I would say Sun entirely in the sign of Sagittarius does well. The person is likely to be in a knowledge-driven career. This is a combination that belongs to professors. Sun doesn't do well entirely in the sign of Capricorn or Aquarius. However, it's likely to give you mixed results in Uttarashadha, which it's ruling, in Shravana, which is ruled by a Sun's friend Moon. It does well in the nakshatra of Dhanishta, which again is ruled by Mars, who Sun considers as a friend. It doesn't do well in Shatabisha. I think it would do better in Purva Bhadapada if it falls in the sign of Pisces. Now in the sign of Pisces, I don't think it's going to be favorable in Uttabhadapada, whose ruler is Saturn. Sun and Saturn share a very difficult relationship. Sun does well, in my view, in Revati, which is the last nakshatra. Here, Sun finds itself in a friendly environment of Jupiter and Mercury. The person having this combination may find oneself in a leader's position, educating the society. Now, if Sun is placed in a strong position in your chart, a high-ranking position is very likely to be bestowed on you under Sun's chapter. Honor from the government, recognition, blessings of goddess Lakshmi, so the person can also see rise in income, rise in fortune, name and fame, gain of reputation, respect in the society, profits in business, fulfillment of ambitions, happiness in the family all around. The person may also buy a property, recovery of a lost kingdom. The person can also start behaving like a king, doing things for others, turning very charitable, happiness from one's family, from parents in particular, sound health. Marriage can also be part of the person's journey, particularly if Venus is involved. Now, if you find Sun in your chart unfavorably placed, and you find Sun's association with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house based on the methodology I had shared earlier, then there's likely to be danger from the king. What that translates to is the person might encounter challenges from the government, punishment or penalty from the government, so you may find yourself on the wrong side of law, fall from a position, defamation, exile, trouble in a foreign country, unjustified opposition from people. You may lose favor from people, loss of wealth, failure in business, separation from parents, particularly one's father. It could be for various reasons. You go abroad for studies, for example, or for other strong reasons too. A reluctance to do good things or doing the right thing. The person may feel my own life is not in order, and the person then feels not very charitable. It can also lead to an onset of a disease or more than one disease. The sun signifies overall health. So if you find sun in your chart not very strongly placed and you're about to enter sun's chapter, take all precautions from a health point of view. There's likely to be danger from snakes and poison. This is the mythology linked with sun. Loss of articles can also be experienced under sun's chapter if sun is not strongly placed. Now let's do moon now. Moon doesn't do well in the first sign, the sign of Aries, given its difficult relationship with Mars. And so I think it doesn't do well for that main reason in the nakshatra of Ashwini. Ashwini's planetary ruler is Ketu. Moon and Ketu also don't have a great relationship. Moon Bharani, I think, is a better position than Moon in Ashwini. With both of them, I wouldn't say are favorable positions for Moon. Moon does very well in the nakshatra of Kritika, particularly if it falls in the sign of Taurus. The mythology linked to Kritika and Moon explains this exalted position. Moon does very well entirely in the sign of Taurus, whether it's the nakshatra of Rohini or the nakshatra of Mrigashira. Moon, I don't think, is going to do very well in the environment of Mercury in the sign of Gemini, particularly in the nakshatra of Mrigashira in Gemini. Ardra in Gemini. Ardra's planetary ruler is Rahu, and Moon does not find Rahu as a friend. Moon does better in Punarvasu. Moon here gets Jupiter's guidance, particularly if it falls in the sign of Cancer. Moon does very well. Moon is less likely to do well in the nakshatra of Pusha, given Saturn's rulership, than in Punarvasu. So in the sign of Cancer, I think it does very well in Punarvasu. Moon is likely to give mixed results in the nakshatra of Ashlesha. The person may become a student of psychology, but at the same time the person might be an outcast or an overthinker. So it can be a difficult position if you don't know the boundaries of overthinking, but altogether I feel it's going to give you mixed results. Moon does reasonably okay in the sign of Leo. I think it does best in the nakshatra of Uttara Phalguni in particular. It does okay in Magha, okay in Purva Phalguni, but better in Uttara Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Leo. The Moon is going to give you mixed results in the sign of Virgo. In the environment of Sun and Moon, the nakshatra of Uttara Phalguni and Hasta does better than in the nakshatra of Chitra. Now, in the sign of Libra and in the sign of Scorpio, I don't think Moon is going to do very well. In fact, in the sign of Scorpio, Moon is debilitated. However, if the nakshatra ruler is favorable, like Vishakha, Moon is likely to do slightly better, particularly if it falls in the sign of Libra. In the sign of Sagittarius, Moon is likely to give mixed results. In the last nakshatra, which falls in the sign it does the best, which is the nakshatra of Uttarashadha, I don't think Moon is going to do very well in the sign of Capricorn. Neither is it likely to do very well in the sign of Aquarius. However, if the nakshatra is ruled by a friend or by itself, it's likely to do better. So in Uttarashadha and in Shravana, and to some extent in Purva Bhadapada, which falls in the sign of Aquarius, it's likely to give you mixed results. In the sign of Pisces, it does well in the nakshatra of Purva Bhadapada, not so well in Uttarashadha, and mixed results in the nakshatra of Revati. Now, if you find Moon favorably placed in your chart, the following events might be part of your journey under Moon's chapter: dawn of fortune, gain of wealth, abnormal profits in business, blessings of goddess Lakshmi, favors from royalty and friends. The person may acquire a kingdom of some kind in the modern world. You might be given responsibility of a business, construction of a new home, particularly if the fourth house is involved, increase in land ownership. The person might have more than one property, gain of agricultural produce or gain in productivity in general, buying of a vehicle, auspicious functions at home, happiness in the family, sound health, religious and charitable inclinations, gain of reputation due to good deeds, devotion to deities, birth of a son, marriage, particularly if the Lord of the 7th house or Venus is involved, association with music and arts, foreign journeys to distant places for leisure, availability of good food, gain of clothes and luxury items in general. So moon essentially is a time for a person to enjoy one's life. Now, if you find moon weakly placed in your chart and you find moon's association with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, there's likely to be moodiness in your behavior under moon's dasha, unhappiness, mental agony, stress, feeling lazy, loss of position, loss of wealth, losses in business, disturbance at home due to any event, something or the other might take your peace of mind away. There might also be danger of theft, wanderings in a foreign land more aimlessly, journeys to difficult places. The person might also fear of mother's health under moon's chapter. Separation can also be there from the mother, danger from water, trouble from people who are working for you, your employees. You may also find yourself being blamed by the government for some wrongdoing, and also the person may find oneself not having good food. The comforts of life might go away to some extent. And if you are going through moon's chapter and you're facing some of these issues, moon's dasha is never very long, so please also look at the dasha table and see when that dasha is coming to an end. Now let's do Rahu. If you find Rahu in Ashwini, Bharani and Kritika, Rahu is not going to do well in my view. It's going to give you mixed results, although it might do better in the nakshatra of Bharani than in the nakshatra of Ashwini. In the sign of Taurus, Rahu is going to do well. Venus and Rahu share a friendly relationship. However, Kritika, Rohini and Mrigashira are ruled by planets Rahu does not consider as a friend, and these planets also does not consider Rahu as a friend. So this can lead to a mixed result. The person can become exceedingly ambitious but also find oneself choosing a path he or she shouldn't. Rahu is going to give mixed results in the sign of Gemini. I think it's going to give best results in the nakshatra of Adra. In Punarvasu too, it's likely to give you better results than in the nakshatra of Mrigashira. In the sign of Cancer, Rahu is in an uncomfortable environment of moon, and therefore I don't think this is a good position for Rahu. It doesn't do well in Pusha, neither is it likely to do well in Ashlesha. It might do better in the nakshatra of Punarvasu. Rahu entirely in the sign of Leo is not going to do well. Leo's planetary ruler is Sun, Rahu and Sun share a difficult relationship. It might do better in the nakshatra of Purva Falguni in this sign than the other nakshatras which fall in Leo. In Virgo, it's likely to give you mixed results. The sign is neutral. Sign ruler rather is neutral, but the nakshatra rulers which are falling in this sign are unfriendly to Rahu, and therefore this is likely to give mixed results. Now Rahu does well in the sign of Libra given its planetary ruler is Venus. I think it does best in the nakshatra Swati. It also does very well in my view in the nakshatra Vishakha as it gets Jupiter's guidance. Rahu isn't likely to do well in the sign of Scorpio given its difficult relationship with Mars, although it might do best in the nakshatra Vishakha again, which falls in this sign given its relationship with Jupiter, which is a friendlier one than its relationship with Mars. Rahu isn't likely to do very well in Mula, even though the environment of Jupiter is friendly. I think it does best in the nakshatra Purvashadha, which falls in this sign given the environment is extremely friendly of Jupiter and Venus. Rahu is likely to give you mixed results in the sign of Capricorn. Mixed results as it has a friendlier relationship with the sign ruler than the nakshatra rulers, which are Sun, Moon and Mars respectively. I think Rahu would do better in the sign of Aquarius than it does in the sign of Capricorn, particularly in the nakshatra Shatabisha, which it's ruling, and also in the nakshatra of Purvabhadapada and the nakshatra of Uttarabhadapada. It's likely to do less better in the nakshatra of Revati than in the nakshatra of Uttarabhadapada, which falls in the sign of Pisces. If Rahu is favorably placed in your chart, then you're likely to travel to far off places for the purpose of leisure. You may also find yourself meeting with people who are occupying a position of authority in a foreign country. You might be recognized by foreign governments, And this in the modern world could lead to you being granted a residency in a foreign country. And I have personally experienced that under Rahu's chapter. You therefore may also find your journey in a foreign country very successful. The person under Rahu's chapter is likely to turn very religious or spiritual, and due to that the person may find oneself visiting holy places. The person may be extremely devoted to deities, may perform religious sacrifices. The person may also turn very charitable. Gain of wealth and reputation can also be part of your journey under Rahu's chapter, although such gains are likely to be short-lived. Favors from the government, success in ventures. The person may also build a new home. Newness in your life is going to be part of your journey. Relations with people who are foreign to you, new to you. Marriage is very likely, particularly if Venus is involved. Now, if you find Rahu unfavorably placed in your chart, you're likely to suffer mental agony. That could be due to newness that Rahu brings into your life. You might find yourself in quarrels without reason. Loss of wealth, loss of position, loss of home or land can be the kind of challenge you might have to face. Issues with government authorities. The person may also encounter health issues. Physical health might be affected, and there may also be an onset of unusual diseases, weakness in the body, issues with partners, business partners, or in personal life. Particularly if Venus is involved, the person may find oneself having issues in one's married life. Now, the best thing to do under Rahu is to not act impulsively, as Rahu, I think, signifies our impulse, and whatever we gain or lose under Rahu is likely to be short-lived. So do not lose hope if you've lost something, and do not build castles in the air if you've gained something. So moderation of your mind is very important whilst you're going through Rahu's chapter. Now let's do Ketu. Ketu does very well in the nakshatra of Ashwini, as it's ruling that nakshatra, and it has a friendly relationship with Mars. It also does okay in Bharani due to a friendly relationship with both Venus and Mars. I don't think it's going to do well in the nakshatra of Kritika and Rohini, as it doesn't have a good relationship with Sun or Moon. It's going to give you mixed results in the nakshatra of Mrigashira, perhaps better results in the sign of Taurus than in the sign of Gemini. It's not going to do well in the nakshatra of Adra, which is ruled by Rahu. It's going to give you mixed results in Punarvasu, as it finds itself under Jupiter's guidance. It has a neutral relationship with Mercury. It's less likely to do well in any of the nakshatras falling in the sign of Cancer. It may find itself in a weak position in the nakshatra of Pushya in particular. It may not do well even in the sign controlled by Sun, although it might do better in the nakshatra of Magha, which it's ruling. It may do well even in Uttara Phalguni, but not so in the nakshatra of Uttara Phalguni, which falls in the sign of Leo. In the sign of Virgo, I think it's likely to do best in the nakshatra of Chitra, as it finds itself in a friendlier environment than in the nakshatras ruled by Sun and Moon. In the sign of Libra, it's in a friendly environment, particularly in the nakshatra of Chitra. It's less likely to do well in Swati. It's going to give you mixed results in the sign of Libra in the nakshatra of Vishakha, as it has a neutral relationship with Jupiter and a friendlier relationship with Venus. So it's a good position altogether. Ketu does very well in the sign of Scorpio. It may not do very well in Anuradha, but the person can be an excellent researcher. I think it does very, very well in the nakshatra of Jyeshtha and Vishakha, which falls in the sign of Scorpio. Ketu would do reasonably okay in the sign of Sagittarius. In the first nakshatra, it does very, very well. In Purvashadha too, it might do okay, although the purpose of Purvashadha and Ketu, there's less common ground there, but it's likely to do okay. Ketu may struggle in the last nakshatra falling in the sign of Sagittarius, which is Uttarashadha, and then in the sign of Capricorn and Aquarius. Given its unfriendly relationship with Saturn, it's likely to struggle, particularly in the nakshatras ruled by Sun, Moon. It might do better in Tanista. It may not do very well in Shatabisha. In Purva Bhadapada, it's likely to do better as it finds itself under Jupiter's guidance. It may not do very well in Uttara Bhadapada given its difficult relationship with Saturn, and I think it's likely to give you better results in the last sign in Revati than in any other nakshatra. I think it might do better even in Purva Bhadapada, which falls in the sign of Pisces. Now, if you have Ketu favorably placed in your chart, you may develop a religious or a spiritual inclination, and you might then make time for yourself to follow that path. You may also get to travel and may also get to gain from foreign travel. You might be recognized by your employer or people who are authority figures in your society. You might be given the responsibility to administer a department, for example. Gains in business and rise in income is also likely to be part of your journey under Ketu's Dasha, although the gains are likely to be of medium level, and if there's enjoyment on a material plane, it's also likely to be moderate. The person can become physically very active. Those are some favorable events that might unfold. If you find Ketu unfavorably placed in your chart, and you also find Ketu associated with the 6th, 8th or the 12th house, you're likely to face issues with authority figures or the government. You may also encounter loss of wealth due to penalties and fines, loss of position, defamation, loss of property. You might be sent away to a foreign land. Excessive expenditure might be part of your journey. You might also become very fearful in life of bad things, mental tension, instability of the mind, particularly if moon is involved. There might be an onset of a disease which might be foreign in nature, unusual in nature, loss of physical strength, obstacles in ventures. You may try to acquire wealth through undesirable, unlawful means. The person may also indulge in sinful acts. There might be a severance of relations with people who are close to you in the family, interference by enemies, quarrels without reasons. The person in the extreme circumstances may also find oneself imprisoned or in isolation. You may find yourself in the company of people who you may consider as inferior to you. There may also be danger that you might experience from thieves and enemies. Those are all Ketu related events that might unfold if Ketu is unfavorably placed. Thankfully, Ketu's chapter is never very long, so if you are going through a difficult time, take into account when Ketu's chapter is going to end and plan accordingly. Well, the example I had taken in this video was of Margaret Thatcher. She became the Prime Minister on 4th of May 1979, and at that time she was going through Rahu's Mahadasha and Saturn's Antardasha. I pointed out to you earlier, Saturn in her chart is exalted. It's very close to the exaltation degree of 20. I am now listing combinations which are linking Saturn to her career. Saturn in her chart is ruling the 10th house, the career related house in the Navamsha and the Dasamsha. Saturn is aspecting the 10th house, and given Saturn's exalted position, she was given this high ranking position. Now, if you recall in the Saturn section of this video where I'd mentioned that you might be recognized for your service by the king, and that actually has played out in her life. She was given the responsibility of leading the country by the queen. If you go one step further, you'd see Saturn at the time when she became the Prime Minister was transiting the 11th house in Purva Phalguni. The 11th house in Purva Phalguni has a lot to do with fulfillment of desire, and Saturn feels very strong in Purva Phalguni given its strong relationship with Venus. She being given a high-ranking position under Saturn's Antardasha, and given Saturn's strong position, I hope you're able to see that connection. She was given this responsibility under Rahu's Mahadasha, and Rahu in her chart is in the house related to her career in the main chart. Furthermore, I also find this very interesting that she stepped down from her position as a Prime Minister on 28th November 1990 which was very close to the end of this Rahu's Mahadasha. So under her Rahu's chapter, she gained a high-ranking position, and right at the end she stepped down. Thank you for your time. This is all that I had to share. If you have any questions, please post a comment, and if you'd like to stay in touch, please subscribe to this channel. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.